Ever since I posted my Forerunner video last year, a few people argued that the real reason the Covenant wanted to destroy humanity was because they were Reclaimers of the Forerunner technology, but they weren't Forerunners themselves. However, if you look at all of the source material from before the time Bungie finished Halo Reach and said their goodbyes, making humans Reclaimers ruins many of the narrative stakes and creates a handful of issues in the story if they are just Reclaimers. In Contact Harvest, the prophets discover that humans are the left-behind Forerunners, and because the Covenant religion's centerpiece is their ascension to godhood by means of the Great Journey, just like the Forerunners once did, if some Forerunners were left behind, then the entire Covenant promise is a lie. The prophets don't fear humans receiving priority with Forerunner technology, but their fear is in their entire faith structure collapsing. This existential threat is what pushes the prophets to wipe out all of humanity, so that the Covenant's ascension to godhood won't be endangered. If humans are only Reclaimers and not Forerunners, then the prophets would only need to justify their existence as being special, similar to how the engineers use technology. Humans are also unique beings like the rest of the Covenant. It also makes no sense why all of humanity would have to die if only some humans were Reclaimers, like was shown in Halo 4 Spartan Ops. Retconning humans to be only Reclaimers weakens the core conflict between the two, and it undermines the story's power, that the gods the Covenant worshipped were actually the ones they were killing. It's poetry when done this way, but when humans are only Reclaimers, it waters down the original story. Even if humans were Reclaimers, that would really only make them the chosen custodians of Forerunner technology, but that in no way endangers the prophets or the Covenant's access to Forerunner technology. On top of that, the prophets could have very easily argued that humans being Reclaimers was a sign of favor or even destiny, but there wouldn't be any urgency for a genocide. A threat like humans being Reclaimers is a manageable one, but if humans are the left-behind Forerunners, then the entire religion is built on a lie where some will be left behind. The motivation of the prophets becomes one that is inevitable and driven by a sense of terror. If someone discovered that humans were Forerunners, the entire Covenant would fall into ruin. If some will ascend but others will be left behind, then who? This is what results in the fear that the prophets have. Here are two quotes from Contact Harvest on the worldview of the Covenant. This belief that one could become a god by following in the Forerunners' footsteps was the crux of the Covenant religion. One day, the prophets had long promised their faithful hordes, "We shall find the holy rings, discover the very means of the Forerunners' transcendence." Dab and billions of his fellow Covenant believe this absolutely. When the great journey begins, we will all walk the path together. This direct quote from Covenant scripture summarized the faith's core promise. Those who showed appropriate reverence for the Forerunners and their sacred creations would inevitably share a moment of transcendence, would journey beyond the boundaries of the known universe just as the Forerunners had, many ages ago. Promised godhood was a message with broad appeal, and all were welcome to join the Covenant so long as they accepted the Sen Shium's sole authority to investigate and distribute holy relics. If some of the Forerunners were left behind, the foundation of the Covenant is all built on a lie. On top of this reveal taking place during the Age of Doubt right after the Ungoi Rebellion, the prophets aren't mad that humans have claim to Forerunner technology. They want to prevent the destruction of their religion and society. Bungie's original intent gives the overall story a more tragic depth that ends up getting lost if the only reason the Covenant want to annihilate an entire race was because those people had dibs on the technology they wanted. People who write stories often refer to that as bad writing. Now, it was Fortitude's turn to feel weak in the knees. He grasped the arms of his throne and tried to come to terms with an impossible revelation. Each glyph represented a Reclaimer, not a relic, and each Reclaimer was one of the planet's aliens, which could only mean one thing. "The Forerunners," the minister whispered. "Some were left behind." This is when the revelation begins to hit truth. He knew the Covenant's core promise that all would walk the path and follow in the Forerunners' footsteps was critical to the Union's stability, and he was certain that if anyone learned they might be left behind, the Covenant was doomed. This is the reason why the prophets enter into a state of grief and want to genocide all of humanity. You have a religion that preaches that all will ascend to godhood, but then you discover that, actually, all will not. "We must take no chances with these Reclaimers," Fortitude could not bring himself to say Forerunners. He grabbed his wattle and gave it a steady tug. They must be expunged before anyone else knows of their existence. If the Oracle speaks the truth, then all we believe is a lie. Fortitude's voice filled with sudden strength. If the masses knew this, they would revolt, and I will not let that come to pass. It's also funny because the book literally says it right there that he wanted to call them Reclaimers because he couldn't stomach calling them Forerunners, which is also why we get this scene at the end of Halo 3.
You are Forerunner!
Now, did Joe Staten go rogue and write the book against Bungie's wishes? According to Paul Russell, Joe didn't have this kind of limitless control and he did not go rogue. In fact, Joe said in an interview that Frank O'Connor and other Bungie staff used the Halo Bible to cross-reference his book to make sure it properly lined up with the lore. So why did Contact Harvest say that humans were Forerunners then? Because that was Bungie's original lore until 343 came along. But the question here is not whether Forerunners were originally human, but does retconning the Forerunners ruin the original story? If the prophets were worried that only humanity would be allowed to ascend to godhood, but members of the Covenant would not, where is that mentioned or stated? It's never even hinted at, compared to Contact Harvest blatantly saying they were afraid that some would be left behind. The entire focus of the Covenant is stated repeatedly. Part of his mind was still gripped with the same questions as all other Covenant. How exactly had the Forerunners accomplished their transcendence? And how might mere mortals do the same? The prophets preached that Halo not only destroyed the Flood, but somehow also initiated the Forerunners' great journey. His unshakable faith in the promise of the Forerunners and their great journey. My biggest issue is this. Throughout the games and books, it is always mentioned that the prophets want to go on the great journey, to ascend to godhood like the Forerunners did. And they always make references to humanity being left behind.
And this time, none of you will be left behind.
I see now why they left you behind.
All of this is known as foreshadowing, and it's important that if you foreshadow, there needs to be a payoff at the end. If humans are simply Reclaimers and not Forerunner, then the foreshadowing has no payoff. There's no narrative satisfaction, and those hints become meaningless. The thematic depth is watered down, as the original purpose was built up to something deeper. If those details are just trivial and it doesn't reshape the story, then the depth is lost. It also waters down the character motivation of the prophets. As they are repeatedly trying to go on the great journey, it makes no sense why they'd need to stop humanity if all humanity are just Reclaimers. It serves no purpose to genocide their entire race if the Covenant can still go on the great journey with humanity around. It also ruins the cohesion. Hints throughout the story make it feel cohesive, but if the payoff is missing, then the story feels empty and all of the foreshadowing is basically just wasted narrative space. In the original Bungie games and novels, nowhere, as far as I've been able to find, does it say the reason the Covenant have to completely annihilate all of humanity is due to the fact that they are Reclaimers. If you can find the exact quote in the games or novels, from the release of Combat Evolved to the end of Halo Reach, including the books in between, feel free to share it with me in the comments. Lastly, in the games it is repeatedly mentioned by the prophets about humans being left behind, which only helps to solidify the point that the entire story was built around the Covenant destroying all of humanity to hide their secret. Even Evil Otto, a former member of Bungie who worked on the original Halo games, said that he noticed in the 343 Forerunner novels that Forerunners were no longer human, and that it was kind of weird because the entire reason the Covenant went to war with humanity was due to the fact that humans were the left behind Forerunners. However, if you make humans Reclaimers and not Forerunners, then several scenes throughout the game make little to no sense. The only way the story flows well is if Forerunners were human. So when Mendicant Bias reveals this information, it is never mentioned to truth what being a Reclaimer means, but being a Forerunner means everything to him. Well, thanks for watching.